Well, good morning to you. Pleasure to have your company this morning. And I'm also joined this morning by, pleasure to have their company too, Matthew Lesh, Head of Research at the Adam Smith Institute, the Free Market think tank, and comedian Mark Dolan. Once again, Brexit has reared its ugly head. I think everyone thought, yes, we went back to quite a few other stories. We were really quite excited to talk about other things other than the B word. And then we had that court decision from the Scottish courts about the proroguing of Parliament being illegal. Boris Johnson lied to the Queen. And then in the evening, we had the publication of the Yellowhammer report, Operation Yellowhammer, which of course was required after a demand from MPs in Parliament for that document for the worst case scenario planning for no deal to be published. Got the thoughts of Mark Dolan and Matthew Lesh on all of this in just a couple more moments. First up though, let's talk to Stewart Hosie. He's the SNP MP for Dundee East. He's also the party's international trade spokesman. Good morning to you.
Morning,
Good
how
morning.
are you?
Very well indeed. Now, we've got lots to get through, an awful lot to get. Let's start, if we may. Well, let's go through this chronologically. Let's start with that court decision yesterday in Scotland's highest court, where it was ruled that Boris Johnson's decision to prorogue Parliament for 5 weeks was illegal. The Court of Session in Edinburgh ruled that very likely the Supreme Court next Tuesday is going to overturn that. But how significant was that decision?
It was hugely significant. The consistency of the rulings by the three judges were very stark, and they were very blunt. And I actually disagree with you. I don't think it is very likely that the Supreme Court will overrule that. It may well be that they will look very carefully at the ruling that was given and the reasons for that ruling, and they will take a decision as to whether to uphold that or whether to overturn it. I think it's very important. It certainly isn't a done deal that will be overturned.
No, okay, yeah, I think you're certainly not a done deal, though an English court has already said they thought it was legal. I mean, quite the most damning thing, you've got some headlines at the front page of the Mirror today saying, Boris Johnson lied to the Queen. It seems to me, though, even as a staunch leaver myself, I remember on air when this was happening, we were saying quite openly, well, of course this wasn't about the state opening of Parliament and the Queen's speech. Of course this was about Brexit. But there'd be an awful lot of people, I think, whether leavers or just people sort of in the middle of this, I think most people probably are, who would have just shrugged and said, yeah, of course this is game playing by Boris Johnson. But hey, your side's done a load of game playing, so let's do a bit of that ourselves. Hold
on a minute. I can't actually believe I'm hearing this. The reason given, the purported reason for the prorogation, was this ridiculous 5-week delay before a Queen's speech at the start of a new session. That's what they said. If you're saying that the real reason was, as we all believe, to run down the clock to get this no-deal Brexit, well, that's a different thing entirely.
100%, of course it was. You know that, I know that, the Queen knew that, everyone knows that.
Well, if that's the case, then it's incumbent on the UK government to release all of the other information relating to prorogation, which has been asked for by MPs, asked for earlier this week. And if it is true that it's clear the prorogation is there simply to run down the clock for Brexit, then it would be pretty obvious to me that the Prime Minister has misled the Queen. Prorogation is, in fact, unlawful, as the judges said yesterday. And I think this puts Boris Johnson in an incredibly bad position. And this, I mean, some people are saying that, if he's lied on the floor of the House, of course, that he would have to consider his position. Lots of MPs lining up to take selfies in the House of Commons yesterday, wanting to say, look, I'm here in the Commons, bring back the House of Commons now. Realistically, though, given how much of a talking shop a House of Commons has been, given you spent 90 minutes praising the wonders of the joys of having John Bercow as the Commons Speaker after he said he was going to stand down at the end of next month on the final day, given that you MPs voted to have that long break over the summer, as always, what exactly would you now do, or would you have done with what we think roughly 6 days of lost sittings that you can't do with the sittings you've already had and will already have before October the 31st? We've been in a position, as you know, facing this cliff edge. We managed, I hope, to take the steps to avert an immediate no deal by requesting the Prime Minister ask for an extension until January. But clearly that's a very short-term interim measure. There's no certainty at all yet, in my mind, as to what it is the government want in relation to Brexit. Do they want a deal, which is what they say? Do they want to crash out with no deal, which is what I believe they want to do? The job of the Parliament is to scrutinise the government, to press the government to get to the truth of this, and hopefully to coalesce around the solution which actually works, rather than being bullied into either Theresa May's bad deal or an even worse no deal.
But aren't we in this situation now? You're saying, look, this is all about, this in sorrow, not in anger, wringing of hands, trying to stop a no deal to prevent catastrophic Yellowhammer forecast. We'll get to those in just a moment. But isn't your side just as guilty of playing games and, let's face it, lying as much as Boris Johnson is on this? Which is that you don't want to prevent you managed to get into a couple of words there in Ramona Bingo, the crashing out, etc., etc. But the reality is, you don't want Brexit to happen at all. And all of these shenanigans in Parliament by a lot of the opposition MPs is actually to stop any Brexit of any sort happening, rather than fears around a no-deal Brexit.
Well, I don't know what Ramona Bingo is. It sounds pretty terrible to me, but I've no idea what it is.
Well, getting in the phrase, the crashing. There are certain phrases everyone has to get: the crashing out, the chaos. There are certain key words that are used again and again and again. And I have to say, I do think that an awful lot of the nation just sort of shrugs and carries on.
Well, I suppose it's a bit like the Yellowhammer papers, with Brexiteer bingo. The poor will suffer most, and the Tories don't care. But in all seriousness, I have read and seen dozens and dozens and dozens of economic assessments about Brexit. They're universally bad, and the no-deal crashing out Brexit is the worst of all. It is incumbent on MPs like me, indeed on all MPs, to try and stop the worst thing happening. And if we must have a Brexit at all, have one at least that works. But that needs the government to compromise rather than bashing on with this kind of...
But you don't think there's any Brexit that works, do you, Stewart?
Oh, I'd rather Brexit wasn't happening.
No, I know that. But you're saying let's have a Brexit that works. What is the Brexit that works for you, which I, as a Leave voter, would recognise as Brexit, i.e. not actually still in the EU?
Indeed. Therein lies the slight problem
exactly.
at the end, because we did put forward a compromise 3 years ago now, which may have actually commanded a majority 3 years ago. But because it maintained the single market, the customs union and freedom of movement, I suspect people like you would have just laughed on the radio and said, oh, no, that's Brexit in name only.
Well, no, that's not even Brexit in name only. That's just Remain. That's all it is.
The problem is that would have been a Brexit, and it would have maintained the good bits of the European Union instead of throwing them out with a bathwater.
Yeah, say the only bit of the good bit is I love free trade. That's the only good bit. That's the only bit I want. Thank you very much. Again, this idea that that's a compromise position, it is laughable with all due respect. Let's talk though about Operation Yellowhammer, because this has been described. And there are two different names for this document. Originally, when it was leaked to the Sunday Times, it was originally called the base scenario. Now it's being called the reasonable worst case planning assumptions. So many people are saying that's a different thing. I'm not entirely sure it is, but it's about the UK leaving the EU without a deal. What could be happening? And it's a 5-page document. It was released at the request, the demand, indeed, of the House of Commons, who voted to have that. And now Michael Gove, the minister overseeing no deal planning, says it's an old document. Since it was published and circulated, the government has done far more to prepare for leaving on October the 31st, deal or no deal. But the planning assumptions are about things like public disorder, massive long delays of days at the ports and the airports, a massive rise in electricity prices, food shortages, rioting on the streets. Do you really think that that's what's going to happen?
Clearly, there's a risk of these things happening.
But do you really think that's going to happen?
Well, I really think that the disruption of the ports is real. I really think the disruption to medical supplies is real. I'm sitting at the moment looking at a small fishing port near where I live. If any of the fish and the shellfish products that come here go to France in refrigerated wagons, and they get down to the border, to the ports, and there's any kind of significant delay, that cargo is completely ruined.
But if they've got the right paperwork, if they've got the documentation they're required to have when we are no longer part of the EU, why would there be a delay for them?
Well, the Yellowhammer documents make clear that huge numbers of businesses are unprepared. You see, there's been so much exiting politics going on. There's been no blinking preparation going on.
But we know that's ongoing now, though, don't we? Would it not be easier for businesses to prepare if they actually believed it was going to happen? If everyone in the country said, right, this is going to happen and this is what we're going to do. We all know exactly what the situation is going to be and this is what we're going to do. When we still have these sort of machinations, is it, isn't it? Will there be a delay? Will there be a letter sent to Brussels on October the 19th? When we have is that not part of the problem?
No, I don't think it is part of the problem. I think the fundamental problem with this, and I do hope you would agree with me, is that when Brexit happened after the vote in 2016, the Brexiteer campaigners, those campaigning to leave, did not have a plan, did not have a Scooby about what it actually meant and how it was going to work. And
well, that was up to politicians to decide, wasn't it? That was up to politicians to enact. The people who were running the Vote Leave campaign were largely not actually elected politicians.
Well, I think there were enough of them, the Faragistes and the Boris Johnsons of this world. These were meant to be experienced politicians who knew what they were doing. Lo and behold, they knew nothing, no plan, and that chicken has now come home to roost.
Well, I think the plan was you'd give notice, you'd have Article 50, you'd have 2 years to plan. And of course, I think the plan for most of those people was that there would be a deal. Unfortunately, we didn't think the deal was going to be trying to be negotiated by someone who didn't want a deal that actually meant us leaving the EU properly. Let's talk now to my next guest. And this relates, of course, back to the Brexit stories over the battles over what we're actually going to be seeing if we don't get a Brexit on the 31st of October. Stephen Timms is Labour MP. He's also a member of the Brexit Select Committee and joins us now. Good morning to you.
Good morning, Julia.
Good morning. Now, we've been talking all morning about the two sort of crucial stories about Brexit that emerged yesterday. One, of course, Operation Yellowhammer, the government's base scenario, their reasonable worst-case planning assumptions, they say, for what could happen in the event of a no-deal Brexit if you don't have any proper contingency planning, but also that court ruling in the Scottish courts. But actually, an awful lot more needs to be debated, and particularly over what the options are right now for either a deal or no deal. Lots of talk among a lot of your Labour colleagues. We spoke to Stephen Kinnock yesterday that there may well be a possibility for a deal, and yet also lots of talk from the front bench that actually they're not looking at really any Brexit at all. They want a second referendum even before a general election. Are you clear as a Labour MP what Labour's actual official policy is today?
Yes. I think all of us are very focused on avoiding leaving the EU without a deal. And my sense is that there is absolute unanimity about that amongst the Labour benches, much more so than there has been for the last year or two. You mentioned I'm on the Brexit Select Committee. Last week we took evidence from the Freight Transport Association, the people representing the truckers, and they told us that long delays at Dover are inevitable if we leave without a deal.
Why are they inevitable if we leave without a deal, if we don't have proper planning and people have the right paperwork?
Well, that's a very good question. But on the most optimistic assumption, this is according to them, at least 2,000 trucks a day will arrive at Dover without adequate French customs documentation to start with. When they get to Calais, they will have to go through hours of checks in a lorry park in order to be let through, and the lorry park has only got 300 spaces. That seems to be the fundamental problem. 2,000 trucks a day trying to get into 300 spaces. And when that lorry park in Calais is full, the authorities in Calais will stop any more ferries coming in. That's so the trucks will back up in Dover.
OK, there are two key assumptions there. One is that there will be checks on every single lorry, which we don't see. Look, we don't see at the current time, even with goods that are coming from outside the EU right now. But also the idea that
the French will check every single lorry. They'll do it when the lorry gets onto the ferry at Dover, so it'll happen on the ferry, and if the truck hasn't got adequate documentation, it'll have to go through an amber lane at Calais, which will take it into this.
Okay, and again, I was just going to say, it's another big if. I can understand that in the early, maybe the first couple of days, people haven't got the correct documentation. We know that there's been a big increase, but not enough of an increase in the number of companies that have applied to get the correct documentation and know what they're doing. But the idea that week after week, all these lorry companies are going to be sending their lorries to Dover and to Calais without the correct paperwork, even though last time they had to wait in a queue and they're thinking, oh, I'll just do it again because it worked out so well last time. I mean, how thick do we actually think that our private contractors actually are in this country?
Well, you'll have seen the Yellowhammer document published overnight. I've been looking at it. I mean, they estimate, this is the government's official estimates, that it'll be 6 months of disruption.
No, it's not. No, it's their worst-case planning assumption.
It's the reasonable worst case. That's right.
Yes.
That's what they're
But you do know a worst-case scenario isn't necessarily what happens. I mean, the worst-case scenario every time I get on a plane is that the plane crashes and I die. But amazingly, it hasn't happened yet, and I get to my destination.
No, but the reasonable worst case is not the worst case, of course. This is the reasonable worst case. And as I say, the Freight Transport Association told us at the committee last week that long delays at Dover are absolutely inevitable.
If people don't have the correct paperwork. Why will people not have the correct paperwork?
Because it's very complicated to do. It is not an easy job filling out adequate, correct, punctilious French customs documentation. As you say, a lot of trucks and companies haven't yet applied for the number that they require. Now, that is a two-minute job.
Because there wasn't enough planning done by the previous government, that's what they're now doing. Again, it's a 2-minute job. But you're saying, amazingly, even though a huge number of companies all around the world are able to fill out the French documentation, the EU documentation, to get stuff into the EU, just uniquely, British companies are going to be totally and utterly incapable of doing that.
No, that is not the case at all. But what is this is the Freight Transport Association representing the lorry companies themselves, saying there will be inevitably long queues for a time. I mean, it'll only take a few months, but for a time there will be serious problems, and that will lead to food shortages, medicine shortages, and fuel shortages. And,
why do we have food? Why do we have food shortages if lorries are having trouble getting out of the country?
That's a very good question. The answer is that a lot of the lorries going out through Dover are going to Europe in order to get a load of food to bring back into the UK. They won't be able to do that because they'll be stuck in the traffic down at Dover.
I mean, I have to say, this is the thing. I completely understand. Absolutely, there needs to be planning. And of course, the rules are going to change. There's going to be a lot of bureaucracy early on for companies. And look, that is something that I would like there to be a free trade agreement, so we wouldn't have to do that. If that's not what we get, then that's not what we get. However, it is a bit of paperwork. The idea that the entire sort of international trading work that goes on between the European Union bloc and us, it sort of almost goes to a standstill overnight. I just find, I've got to be honest, it's quite laughable.
The day after the Freight Transport Association came to our committee, Michael Gove came, and I said to him, how confident are you that the Freight Transport Association is mistaken? And his reply was, they're not mistaken. They're not making this up. These are real problems that we would face if we were to leave the EU.
If we didn't make contingency plans.
No. Even with the contingency plans. They've been planning, as you know, for months and months and months for this. And this is the 2nd of August situation that's just been published.
But why would there be delay if everybody is told what the paperwork they need to do? And there'll still be lorries even right now who don't have the correct paperwork. But if everyone's got the right paperwork and everyone knows what they need to do, and people are transporting goods legally within the framework of trade we have, given that France does huge amounts of trade with America and they don't have a trade deal with them, God knows how that stuff gets into the country or gets out of the country. There's no reason. I mean, a few hours of delays at the ports, I think most people who believe in democracy can put up with. The idea that it's going to be months of delays when people are going to apparently make exactly the same mistake every single day with their business, every single day, not learning any lessons. I genuinely find it laughable.
Well, it is a rather banal problem, but that is the problem that we face. And it's worse leaving the EU at the end of October because we're so dependent on importing fresh food from overseas. If it had happened in the summer, it wouldn't have been so bad because we're growing food ourselves. But obviously in November, we're not.
Well, hold on a minute. We're getting fresh food from overseas. Not much of that food's therefore coming from the European Union. They've got the same weather as us.
Well, it'll be coming from southern Europe. I mean, obviously, wherever it's coming from in Europe, a great deal of it, comes through Calais, Dover. 3/4 of medicines, according to the Yellowhammer document, come through Calais to Dover.
Vast majority of the goods coming from the outside of the UK actually come by ship. They're not going to be affected. They're nothing to do with the EU.
Well, most of our food that we import comes from Europe. and a very large proportion of it comes from Calais to Dover.
But you know,
And
one of the
that's
reasons why we import a lot from but we import a lot of it from
banal
Europe because we don't have to put tariffs on it, whereas we have to have tariffs on it. I go to the supermarket. The supermarket shelves are full of goods from New Zealand, from Chile, from Argentina, from around the world.
The great majority of the food we import comes from Europe. And even some of that is from further afield comes through Europe. And that's the problem. The same with medicines, three-quarters, and fuel shortages being predicted here as well. So this is not something we should be doing. I'm certainly not going to be voting in favour of it. My view is Parliament should be sitting to scrutinise all of this. We shouldn't have been sent away by Boris Johnson to avoid scrutiny. And we should definitely not be leaving the EU without.
Okay, let's get to our first guest of this, our former Attorney General. He was a Conservative MP, Dominic Grieve. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
Good morning. I want to get on to the point about whether you may return to be a Conservative MP, now sitting as an independent after the whip was withdrawn in just a few moments, Dominic. But it does seem our entire country is being ruled by Dominics right now. But let's talk about that court decision yesterday, the highest court in Scotland, the Court of Session in Edinburgh, ruling that the prorogation of Parliament for 5 weeks by Boris Johnson was illegal, that he lied to the Queen. That's what their ruling said quite blatantly about the reasons for that prorogation. Does that mean that Parliament, you think, will have to come back? And if so, what is it that you, along with the other rebel Remainer alliances you're being known, what will you actually do with that time?
I don't know what the decision will be of the Supreme Court next week. There are some quite complicated legal issues involved. There are also factual issues. I suspect the factual issues are now probably pretty well established. And that is that the government misled Parliament and the public about its reasons for suspending Parliament, and that the true reasons were to try to marginalise Parliament and prevent it from asking awkward questions of the government at a period of national crisis. I think that's pretty clear and will probably remain clear whatever the decision is next week. But it's quite a complex issue as to whether this is an area in which the courts can and should intervene. I'm going to wait and see what the Supreme Court says.
Well, I mean, you say asking awkward questions and things, but realistically, I mean, there were plenty of time to ask awkward questions in the last few weeks. We did see. I mean, Parliament was not sitting over the summer as voted for by MPs at this crucial time. We already had that October the 31st date on the very last day, when Parliament sat, 90 minutes was spent telling John Burke what a fabulous person he was, rather than actually debating the issues.
Well, it may be that more time was taken saying words about the Speaker than should have been. That's another
I'd say
matter.
roughly 89 and a half minutes too long.
I can't prevent colleagues taking points of order. What I will say is that we can already see that if we were sitting today, we'd be asking the government about the Yellowhammer papers, which they finally revealed, show some marked differences between it and bits that were previously leaked, highly relevant about the country's well-being and future in the immediate aftermath of Brexit, and we're not there to do it.
OK, let's talk about that document, because it does seem to me that, again, as we see often in this case, everything is polarised, and the Remainers say, look, evidence of how terrible it's going to be, and a lot of Leavers just sort of shrug and say, more Project Fear, don't believe it. Of course they would say that, wouldn't they? How concerned are you that this would be the case? Because it seems to me a lot of the people who are saying that a no-deal Brexit would be absolutely terrible are also the same people who say that any Brexit of any kind would be absolutely terrible.
The government needs to be honest and upfront about its own assessments, and it's tried to conceal them. And its own assessments is that a no-deal Brexit is going to be very disruptive and affect people's quality of life, in some cases their well-being and their health. But those are serious issues. It's unprecedented in peacetime for a government to inflict this kind of thing deliberately on its own citizens. It may be something which happens if you have a hurricane or a storm, but it's not something which you go around and do to yourself. And my view is that Brexit is a very bad idea, but no-deal Brexit is an even worse idea because of that. It's inevitable that people are going to make an assessment based on their judgment on Brexit, because I suppose if you think that Brexit is the most wonderful thing that can happen to this country, you may think that a period of several months' disruption is a price worth paying. I personally don't think it is. But in any event, the government should be honest about the consequences of its own policies. And it is the dishonesty that has crept in, the tendency to say one thing when it becomes perfectly plain that there is another, which corrodes trust in government and corrodes trust in our democracy. That's what bothers me the most at the moment.
I think you could say, there are lots of people shouting at the radio right now, with all due respect, Dominic Grieve, saying, look, the corroding of trust has happened by the failure to deliver Brexit 3.5 years on from a vote when we were told, within a leaflet sent to our homes, paid for by our own taxes, that vote would be implemented. But it's interesting, you say this thing, government inflicting this deliberately on its citizens. Polling shows there's actually a lot of support for a no-deal Brexit. I'd rather have just a free trade agreement and have a deal of some sort, certainly not the withdrawal agreement, a treaty that Theresa May was trying to inflict on us. But British people were told that Brexit would be terrible under all circumstances by the Remain. They were told by everyone in the establishment. They were told by... Can I finish? They were told by business. They were told by the civil service. They were told by every economist, everybody, that Brexit of any kind would be terrible and a no-deal Brexit would be the worst kind of it. They've been told it again and again. And yet there still seems to be roughly 50, 52, maybe 48% for this to happen anyway. This isn't being inflicted on citizens. This has been chosen freely by our citizens.
Well, firstly, there is no evidence that there's a majority in this country wanting a no-deal Brexit at all. The evidence is completely to the contrary. Secondly, the people who were successful in the referendum of 2016 were the Leave campaign, who assured people that leaving would be easy with a deal and that it would be entirely to our advantage.
But it would have been if we hadn't had it negotiated by a Remainer Prime Minister and undermined by a Remainer Civil Service and Commons.
It's all part of a sort of new conspiracy theory, because the truth is that it was always, I think, going to end this way because it is a mistaken decision.
Oh, no. With all due respect, it was always going to end this way because MPs like yourself did not respect the outcome of the referendum decision. If the country had got together and everyone said, right, fair enough, this is what was voted for, losers consent, let's get the best deal. The country, we hadn't had some of your colleagues negotiating behind the scenes with the European Union leaders and the European Commission, behind the backs of the government, behind the backs of the British people, we would have had a good deal.
Well, no, this is just hard leave propaganda. It's always about conspiracy. It's always about somebody else being to blame. It's always about if only the right choice had been made at the right time, we wouldn't be where we are. The truth is that it is a thoroughly mistaken decision, which is taking our country to a bad future, and a no-deal Brexit will be even worse. At the moment, I'm focused on stopping a no-deal Brexit. What I am prepared to do, and I've said it repeatedly, is work with the Prime Minister and indeed anybody else, including Leavers, in trying to bring this sorry saga to an end. There's only one way in which it can be done in the circumstances that have arisen, and that is we'll have to end up having a second referendum and asking people, putting to them the choices available, and they will make the decision. And I will stop talking about it. If people want to leave on a no deal and they vote for that, as far as I'm concerned, that's it. I won't raise the subject again, even if I think people are thoroughly mistaken in what they're doing.
Okay.
But what we cannot go on doing is just going round and round in circles with the government trying to pull the country out of the EU on no deal when there is no evidence of support for this.
Well, I mean, I have to dispute that because the polling repeatedly, when people are given the choice between, again, for instance, one of the polls that asked the question, a Boris premiership with a no-deal Brexit or a Corbyn premiership, and people said the majority has gone for that no-deal option. It may not be their first choice for a lot of people, but they'll take that over no Brexit, and it certainly has a preference over a second referendum and other things. Just finally, time is against us, Dominic Grieve, but I must ask you also about the report on front page of some of the papers today, the idea that actually the Tory rebels like yourself, 21 of you lost the Tory whip after voting against or voting with the opposition to hand the control of the order paper to the opposition. You've been offered an olive branch of a way to appeal, a ray of light to get back into the party. Will you be seeking to appeal the decision to remove the whip from you and to be allowed to stand as a Tory candidate the next election, whenever it is?
I would be delighted if the party can heal its wounds and I can be in amity and concord with my colleagues in the Conservative Party. But that will come about when we can find a common policy position that we can take forward together. Otherwise, I think the suggestions put forward are pointless, and I might add that at the moment I've had no approach from the whips to myself on the subject.
But so are you saying while there is still a policy to go for a deal or no deal Brexit, you will not want to rejoin your parliamentary
It's not
colleagues?
a question of not wanting to rejoin the party. After all, I've been chucked out. So as far as I'm concerned, I wouldn't have left the party despite my rebellion because there are matters on which we are in agreement. But I'm not going to go along to request my return into the party by an appeal process. I think the Prime Minister was wrong to deprive us of the whip, but it was his choice. He's got to make up his mind what he wants.
I wonder if getting to a planet that's habitable around another sun might be easier than ever delivering Brexit. Let's talk about all this with Lord Charlie Falconer. He's a former Justice Secretary, Labour peer. Good morning to you.
Good morning, Julia.
Now, let's just talk, first of all, if we can, about this court decision yesterday in Scottish courts. We know this is going to be appealed in the Supreme Court in London on Tuesday by the Prime Minister, by the government. But a very dramatic day. The Court of Session in Edinburgh yesterday ruled that Boris Johnson, when he asked for that 5-week prorogation of Parliament of the Queen, he lied to the Queen, and therefore his reasons given for the shutdown of Parliament made that decision illegal. What happens now as a result of that? If that court decision is upheld by the Supreme Court, as many think it won't be, but if it is upheld, does Parliament have to come back? And if so, what's Parliament going to talk about in that time?
Well, I think if the decision is upheld, it's as if the prorogation proclamation had never taken place. That would leave Parliament not prorogued, but in recess. And it would then be actually for the government to ask the Speaker to recall Parliament from what would then be a recess. And I think they would have to recall Parliament at that time because it would be only right and proper that Parliament should discuss what had happened constitutionally, as well as discussing issues, for example, like the Operation Yellowhammer documents that were produced during the course of yesterday, and also the government's refusal to produce the wider number of documents that the humble address asked them to produce. So there'd be a hell of a lot to talk about, Julia.
There would be, apart from the fact that given that there's so much to talk about, and given actually, this week is already lost already, given that we're looking at a total of roughly 6 days that have been lost, Parliament had the whole of summer to discuss and talk about all of these issues, but chose to be away on holiday, and MPs have to vote to do that. And then on the last day, on Monday, they knew Parliament would be prorogued in the evening. They chose to spend 90 minutes of that time telling the Speaker, John Bercow, what a fabulous man he was, quite erroneously in my view. There's really no evidence that whether Parliament's sitting or not, any extra decision-making or scrutiny actually takes place, is there?
That's absolute rubbish. If you look at the last week that Parliament sat, it passed an Act of Parliament that will require the Prime Minister, if he hasn't got a deal, by the 19th of October, to seek an extension from the European Union. Now, it may be, Julia, that you disagree with that Act of Parliament, but the idea that it is not significant, the idea that it does not express Parliament's view on the issue of Brexit is complete nonsense.
OK, well, I mean, certainly the Parliament was able to pass that vote the other day and to get that order to basically stop a no-deal Brexit. Are you convinced now that is actually going to do its job and prevent a no-deal Brexit? I certainly sense a lot of doom and gloom on some of the Leaver side in terms of they feel that they've been scuppered. But then there also seems to be this view that there is a cunning plan and it's all part of this 4D chess game that the Prime Minister's advisor, Dominic Cummings, is playing. And of course he knew that MPs would try and do this, and he wanted to force you into a position where you were trying to tie his hands, and then he could be the hero delivering Brexit. Do you think it's worked or not?
Well, I've heard both points of view. On the one hand, this is Dominic Cummings trying to set the Prime Minister up against Parliament and the court, and that will give him huge amounts of support among the public. That, as I understand it, is Cummings' cunning plan. The other side of the coin, which is also argued, is that actually it's been a total shambles on the part of the Prime Minister and Dominic Cummings. They never expected that in the light of the prorogation it would be possible to pass the Act that was passed. They never expected that Parliament would prevent there being a general election, and they certainly never expected that the courts might say that the prorogation was unlawful. It feels like a shambles. And the reason I think it's a shambles is because Boris Johnson was saying at the beginning of last week, it would be impossible for me to do any negotiations if this act was passed. This act is now passed, and he is scuttling around European capitals, as far as I can see, trying desperately to get a deal. And that feels like a change of position on his part. I think the public hope for somebody to be in control of this process, and the Prime Minister looks at the moment as if he's lost control.
Isn't one of the problems, though, is that the people like yourself who are trying to prevent, and we've spoken to many guests this morning, prevent the horrors they feel there would be of a no-deal Brexit, actually, you're being as dishonest as Boris Johnson is accused of being as dishonest to the Queen. Look, you and I both know that the reason why Parliament was prorogued is because Parliament's been playing a load of games. He's playing a game back. An awful lot of people on both the Leave and Remain side will just shrug and say, it's all dirty politics at this point. But the reality is, you're not trying to stop a no-deal Brexit because you're terribly concerned about medicine shortages. You're trying to stop Brexit altogether. And actually, it's a little bit dishonest of not just MPs, but peers to pretend they're doing anything else.
I think some people do want to stop Brexit altogether. The Liberal Democrats are quite open about that. Very many of my Labour colleagues are quite open about that. For me, and for a large number of both Labour MPs and Labour peers, the right course is to respect the referendum result and seek a deal, the best deal that can possibly be.
I don't remember deal being on my ballot paper. When I put that cross next to the word leave, and presumably you put your cross next to the word remain, I don't remember it saying leave with a deal. The campaign talked about that. It didn't require a deal.
I'm not sure what point you're making, Julia. The point
you're saying that to respect the referendum result, we have to leave with a deal. And I don't think to respect the referendum result, we have to leave with a deal because it didn't mention it on the ballot paper.
Whether it mentioned it or not, my view is we should leave, and the best way to leave is with a deal. And I don't think one needs to resolve the issue of whether a no deal was authorised or not. Surely one's got to make a judgment about what's best in the national interest, and surely what's best in the national interest is we move on. The country would be damaged by leaving with no deal, so let's leave with a deal.
OK, but again, it's all predicated on getting a deal, isn't it? Now, there's been some hopeful signs from Angela Merkel, the German Chancellor, the last couple of days about an orderly exit. And there's also been quite a lot of conversations, I think, around European capitals about actually, they're kind of fed up with us now. And if all the uncertainty is bad for them as well as the uncertainty is bad for us, in which case, let's just get it all over and done with. Now, if we could get a deal that was a free trade agreement, so we dealt with all those issues that many on the Remain side say there will be a concern about, travel, goods getting in and out of the country, then I'm sure vast majority of people in the country would be happy whether they voted leave or remain. But right now, it doesn't look like that's on the table. If it is just a reheated version of Theresa May's withdrawal agreement, you know perfectly well the Brexit party is going to be on a surge. Maybe the Liberal Democrats still are eating into a lot of Labour votes as well. Tory party probably unable to get a majority, but any other party also. We're going to be stuck in this limbo forever.
I'm not sure that we are, Julia. I think that the country, what do I mean the country? A lot of people I talk to, and it may be completely random, do seem to want an end to this wrangle about whether we leave, and if so, on what terms, if any. There'll be huge amounts of things to resolve on whatever basis we leave, but I get a very strong feeling that if we did leave, preferably with a deal, that would bring to an end Brexit, swallowing every other issue in our politics at the moment.
Thank you very much indeed, Lord Charlie Falconer, former Justice Secretary and Labour peer. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Right now, we are joined by our next guest, and that is the Defence Secretary, Conservative MP, of course, Ben Wallace. Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
Good morning. Well, let's talk about. Goodness me, there is an awful lot to talk about, Mr. Wallace. Let's talk about first of all this Operation Yellowhammer that has been published last night by the government, forced by MPs in the House of Commons, telling us about the worst case scenarios if we do have a no deal Brexit. Now, base scenario, it's called in one document. One last night said it was reasonable worst case planning assumptions. You're somebody who campaigned for Remain. Are you concerned that we are going to be facing food shortages, delays, disorder on the streets, riots, electricity supplies broken and all the rest of it?
I think, Julia, what's been missed in a large amount of the sort of hysteria being peddled by the opposition on the Yellowhammer is these are the planning assumptions, and what you have to add to it is, and if the government did nothing about it. I mean, these are us painting a whole range of scenarios where if you did absolutely nothing, what could we expect? Now, of course, the government isn't doing nothing about it at all. We meet every single day. The Chancellor's opened his checkbook. We have planned resilience. We've planned alternative sourcing. We have planned, backup, the sort of the function that government does, the glass guarantor, the insurance policy. We do all of that. And so that's what people shouldn't forget, that this is an assumption about paint the picture, what could be the worst cases, and then you have to add, and if the government did nothing about it. Well, we are doing something about it, and so I'm fairly confident, I'm confident that in many of these scenarios we won't get that. And at the same time, we are actually working to try and get a deal with the EU, contrary to allegations, and hopefully we'll be in a much stronger place, so that huge amounts of this scenario thing will never happen.
But you say you're fairly confident, not very confident, in many of these scenarios we won't get that. That's not the most reassuring thing for a senior cabinet minister to say.
No, I am. Look, I didn't correct myself. I said, look, I am pretty confident that 99.9% of most of these things will not happen. But of course, what we do know, we're divorcing from a deep relationship of 40 years. No one is going to say it is going to be totally painless. No one is going to say that this thing is not going to see a change. But what it will say is that if the government does something about it and uses its might and its power and its money, and your taxpayers' money, to do something about it, we can mitigate in the vast majority of cases those effects on people. And I think that's right. And if I hadn't planned for that, if I didn't have scenario planning, you would quite rightly have me on your programme the day something goes wrong and said, why didn't you plan for it? And so, of course, we're planning for it. And as Defence Secretary and as previously as Security Minister, that's what I used to do every day about horrendous threats to this country. It is the bread and butter for government, and to make a sort of conspiracy that the Labour Party are trying to do out of the scenario planning is completely misses the point. Of course we will do that.
Okay, well,
we will do something about it.
Talking of conspiracy, of course, there's some accusations. There's been a bit of conspiracy about the prorogation of Parliament. The Scottish Court yesterday, Court of Session in Edinburgh, ruled that Boris Johnson's plan for a 5-week shutdown of Parliament was illegal, that he lied to the Queen about the reasons, said it was all about having a shutdown ahead of the Queen's speech, when in fact it was really about trying to shut down Parliament over the issue of tackling a no-deal Brexit. Now, of course, you a couple of weeks ago got in some hot water after you were overheard chatting with the French Defence Minister talking about this and basically suggesting that, actually the prorogation was really as a result of the politics rather than of trying to get a Queen's speech. Did Boris Johnson lie to the Queen?
No, of course he didn't. And secondly, two parts to this. First of all, the hot water I got into was rather curious, given that what they didn't clip was what I said earlier to the journalists, that of course we prorogue regularly, often every year, in order to have a new parliamentary session. So if you put that in perspective, it wasn't the great conspiracy that was reported by some of the media. But the reality is, we of course differ in our view of the Court of Session's ruling, and not only do we, but the High Court of England took a completely different view a few days before. That was a just as significant, if not more significant, ruling, which is why we're going to appeal to the Supreme Court. And one of the reasons the High Court of England rejected the scenario that was painted in the Court of Sessions was because it didn't shut down debate. Everyone saw what happened last week. Parliament met, Parliament changed the law, Parliament had a debate, Parliament will be back on October the 14th, before Brexit Day, to have as many day hours as it's going to on Brexit. So it has simply not been the case that proroguing Parliament has been used or was the intention to shut down debate, because that didn't happen. As you and I know, last week we met, they changed the law, people tried to block no-deal Brexit with legislation. So that is not effectively the case, and that's why we're appealing at the Supreme Court. And whatever the Supreme Court finds, of course we will uphold the rule of law. We believe in the rule of law and the independence of the judiciary. and we will carry out whatever its ruling is.
OK, just finally, we have a bizarre situation where we're going for a no deal and a deal at the same time, but there's been a lot of concern from people like Amber Rudd, who left the government at the weekend, saying she's worried that actually it's all about no deal and not about getting a deal. A lot of concerns from the other side of the party, the Leavers, that actually it's all about getting a deal now, offering an olive branch to those 21 Remainer rebels. Although we spoke to Dominic Grieve earlier, and he said no olive branch had yet been offered to him. But this idea that actually Boris Johnson is now scrambling around trying to get a deal, which perhaps many on the Leave side won't like. He's ruled out, we're told, any sort of pact, any deal with the Brexit party. They want to go for a clean break, no deal Brexit. This cunning plan that apparently Dominic Cummings had hatched to get this over the line, deal or no deal, do or die Brexit, doesn't seem to be working out very well. Is there a plan? And what is it?
Well, there is a plan. There is a plan that's very clear to say we are going to properly prepare for no deal, put resource behind that planning to make sure in the worst case scenario we are in a place to meet what the consequences of that. But at the same time, there is a plan to mitigate the parts of the last deal, such as the backstop, to get rid of that and find alternatives. There is an engagement across Europe. I myself have spoken to my counterparts in the defence ministries around Europe to try and make sure we find a way through. But, I don't disagree with your observation. Any leader leading this country at the moment has that challenge of balancing a whole range of views. And, the one thing that I said, that I, totally stand by in the issue of when I was talking to my French counterpart is, Parliament has been incredibly good at articulating for the last 3 years what it doesn't want, but utterly useless at saying collectively what it wants. That's why we had leaders, and leaders have to make those decisions, popular or unpopular, to deliver on something. And in this case, I am a Democrat. There was a referendum result, whether we like it or not, whether you remain or leave, the democratic expression of the United Kingdom people was to leave the EU. Then there was a general election in which the Labour Party and the Conservative Party stood on a manifesto, a promise to say we will carry out the wishes of that referendum and trigger Article 50 and do all of that. And those were the two expressions of public will. And we are mandated as members of Parliament and as ministers, whether we like it or not, to carry out those instructions. And I think that is really what people should not forget in this. And that is going to be very hard for our Prime Minister when a number of my colleagues across the House, certainly people in the Labour Party flip-flopping around with their position, are determined to ignore those two democratic wishes.
Right now, let's talk about those forecasts for not just food shortages, but long delays, days-long delays for some lorries, disorder on the streets, riots, shortage of medical supplies, possibly even we might have the situation where we have people dying through lack of those medical supplies and riots on the streets. Let's talk about all of that with Christine Jardine, who's the Lib Dem spokeswoman on the Home Affairs, and joins us now. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
Good morning, Christine. Lots has been talked about, lots of the papers splashing with this Yellowhammer, Operation Yellowhammer report. Now, originally, when it was leaked to the Sunday Times about a month ago, its contents were described as a base scenario. That was what was on the heading. This time around, it's called the reasonable worst case planning assumptions. Now, a little later in the show, we're going to be talking to Ian Duncan-Smith, who is, obviously, the former Tory party leader. He's seen an early draft of this and says, look, this is the possible worst case. This isn't actually going to happen. We've just been speaking to the Defence Secretary, Ben Wallace, who said, he was 99% confident that this wouldn't come about. Should we be concerned about any of it?
Yes, we should. It's only the tip of the iceberg. I mean, what we've got here is just 5 pages. 5 pages which are very much the things that when we were warning they could happen, that they were possible. The government was saying it was scaremongering, but now we have the evidence that the government also believes that these things are possible. And you know what? 99.9% isn't enough for me when, as you said yourself, people's livelihoods could be at risk, but more importantly, their lives could be at risk. So
do you live in can I clarify? You live in a world. You live in a world where you can be 99% sure of safety all the time. That's amazing.
Well, I think actually in this situation there is a way of being 100% sure it doesn't happen, and that's simply to stop Brexit. And to have a referendum, go back to the people and say, is this what you really want? Now we know, we have the evidence from the government of what could happen. go back to the people and ask them if it's what they want. Or if we have a general election, we will stand on a platform of just stopping Brexit with a democratic mandate to do that.
Well, you say there's a 100% way of doing it, not delivering Brexit. I do wonder, when we talk about fears of riots on the streets and things, actually, are you not concerned at all about the reaction of the British people in the event of their democratic vote not being upheld? Because I know quite a lot of people who say, they believe in the rule of law. They believe in, you don't go rioting on the streets. We're not French after all. But they are increasingly concerned that their vote is not being listened to.
I am very concerned, actually, that people are not being listened to. I agree with you there, and I think the people who are not listening is actually this government, and they're doing their best to silence anyone who disagrees with them, which is worrying. That's not something that's very British. That's something I thought would never happen, that we would have a government which would suspend Parliament so that it didn't face scrutiny. And one of the problems we have with this Yellowhammer report, which is out now, is that the government has effectively tried to silence Parliament to prevent it being scrutinised. Because, we're not there. We can't do that. But we will continue to speak up. They can try and silence the voice of the elected representatives of the people in Parliament. But, I'm on here today. We will continue to scrutinise and call this government out on what it's doing.
OK, obviously there are concerns. Again, if there was no contingency planning, no planning at all, then obviously there would be concerns because people are going to turn up with the wrong paperwork. No one's going to know what's going to happen. But we are told, are we not, that again and again by everybody that it's in everyone's interest for there to be a deal. And even if there isn't a formal deal, a Brexit deal, withdrawal agreement or whatever, there are certainly already many arrangements in place agreed between the ports, between various different countries on, for instance, things like planes. A year or so ago, we were told, planes are going to fall out of the sky. They're not going to be allowed to fly. We're not going to have, any lots of other aspects of things which have already all been sorted out. The reality is it's in everyone's interests involved, whether it's the businesses, whether it's the French government, the German government, the Belgian government or the British government, for trade to continue on all sides, particularly with the German government. We're looking at them. They're looking at heading into recession any moment now. Angela Merkel, the Chancellor, is quoted in the papers today as saying, she's pretty confident that there's going to be some sort of, a sensible, a reliable departure. So why do you think it won't happen?
The best way of avoiding or all of this, or if there is a recession, of being protected and mitigating against the impact, is to stay in the European Union, to be part of that enormous trade bloc, which is one of the most powerful trade blocs in the world, along with America and China and Russia. We are depriving ourselves of the protection of the European Union. Now, it's good to have contingency planning in any situation, but when you look at the contingency planning and you see that there is an option which would avoid all of it, and that option is staying in the European Union, stopping Brexit, then surely that's the sensible thing to do.
Again, I sort of despair at the idea that we need this protection, that we're not a proud nation state. Most countries in the world.
We are a proud nation
state.
Well,
but Christine, most countries
that sees the sensible. We're a proud nation state that reached out 40 years ago to our partners and said, you know what? We've been through a lot together. Let's try and build a better future. And that's what we did. And that's what we should continue to do. We are strong within the European Union, and we should remember that, and we should work with it.
Okay. I would argue I absolutely want the free trade, and I'm absolutely happy to work with our wonderful friends and continental cousins. It doesn't mean they have to have a sentence. But the argument you just made, and it's all very lovely. Now, it sounds wonderful on a stage at the Lib Dem conference in the next week, and everyone's going to be cheering and clapping and agreeing you. The trouble is, you put that case to the British people in 2016, and they gave their answer. You put that case again in 2017.
3 years ago.
Yeah, I don't know.
You put that case to the British people.
Okay,
and you liked it.
And you put that case in 2017 in the general election.
That case last year,
Christine, please, I won't interrupt you. Would it be all right if we could just finish it, because it's not very nice for the listener to hear. In 2017, you put that case, and yes, you did pretty well. But you're not the government, which is a bit of a giveaway, with only 12 MPs you were elected with in that year. And again, at the European elections in May, again, Lib Dems did very well, but you came second, a very, very long way behind the Brexit Party, which came first. So I'm not quite sure why you think that, even though you think it's not a good idea, I think the thing that a lot of Leavers don't understand is why, because you think it's not a good idea, do you think that gives you the right to override the wishes of the majority?
No, that's not what That's not what we're saying. What we're saying is that Joe Swenson's Liberal Democrats are the strongest party for Remain. And there is a huge groundswell in this country which supports Remain and is getting round Joe Swenson's Liberal Democrats joining us every day. Now, look at those election results in 2019. We did put our argument to the people and they did like it. And they're continuing to like it because they see the reality of Brexit. Now, we're not trying to say that you ignore the results 3.5 years ago. Of course you don't. But you
are. No, you are saying that.
Come on, you said I wasn't interrupting you. You give the people the opportunity to say whether or not they've changed their minds. Because democracy is not a static thing. You don't make a decision and you're stuck with it. Every 5 years we change government. But also, democracy depends on different voices. How do any of us know that we're right unless we hear the opposing argument? You can't just silence your opponent. You have to give them a vote.
No, I'm good. Christine, no one has silenced the Remainers. You guys have droned on for 3 years. No one silenced you. But also, I have to check up on this point. This idea that democracy doesn't stop at every 5 years we change government. We do. We have an election. We enact the result of that election and a government is formed. And then we have another election. Obviously, it may well be sooner than 5 years in this case. But we don't. That's not what's happened with the referendum. If we enacted the result of the referendum and then people wanted to think again and you wanted to campaign to start to go back in, that would be completely democratically legitimate. But you cannot compare having a referendum, fighting against it, ignoring it for 3 or 4 years, and then say that that's the same as having an election every 5 years. It just isn't the same thing.
What we're saying is that we had a referendum, and the people said to the government, right, we want to leave the European Union. Now go off and negotiate and see what you can do.
Not in principle, in practice.
Hang on a second. 3 years later, we're no further down the line. The government has
Thanks to people like you.
The government has not been able to come up with a good deal. Now we have a government that's trying to suspend Parliament, silence the voice of the people. Why are they doing that? If opinion hasn't changed, if people still think, despite all this madness that we're seeing, despite what we're hearing from the government about the potential problems, if they still think it's a good idea, why won't the government say, OK, have a referendum?
OK, no, if opinion has changed, why not have a general election? If people are so opposed to what Boris Johnson says he wants to, he was elected on a mandate from his own party members and his MPs for a deal or no deal Brexit on October the 31st. If he's got it wrong, and if I've got it wrong, and all the other leavers who want to do that have got it wrong, and actually there was a majority of the country who are horrified by that and would like to stop it from happening, let's have a general election. I understand you don't trust Boris Johnson. He might move the date if we did it under the Fixed Term Parliament Act. It is perfectly possible for there to be a vote in Parliament that can actually be held to, and we have that general election. We get that decision a couple of weeks before we go to we go to October the 31st, and then you'd have a chance to stop it, backed by a mandate of the will of the people. Why are you afraid of a general election if you're so convinced the people are on your side?
I'm not. I'd quite happily have a general election.
Then why didn't you vote for one?
The reason I didn't vote for one is because we want to be absolutely sure that potential, which the government itself and its own paperwork is now saying is a possibility, we want to be absolutely sure that we don't crash out of Europe and that possibility becomes a reality.
No, a general election before October the 31st. I've just given you the scenario. Voting for a general election on a particular date, everyone agrees that that's the date, October the 15th or whatever date it is, but before October the 31st. You could have done that. Your party and the other opposition parties refused it. If you're convinced that opinion is with you, put it to the people and let them decide.
We were not convinced that it would not mean crashing out. I'd happily go to the country tomorrow, Julia, if we could be absolutely sure that we weren't going to crash out, and the potential which Boris Johnson's own government have said is a possibility. If we could be absolutely sure that that wasn't going to happen, if we had an extension to Article 50 to allow a general election, I'd happily do it. But the interests of the country, the interests of avoiding that potentially disastrous scenario have to come first. It's not about what's best for the Liberal Democrats.
Is it not?
A general election would be best for us. It wouldn't be best for the country.
Good morning to you.
Morning, Peter.
Good morning. Well, we've spoken to many people on the Remain side of things who are very concerned about this. But I spoke to the Defence Secretary, Ben Wallace, in the last half hour. He says, look, he's 99.9% convinced that these worst-case scenarios aren't going to happen. This was originally leaked a month ago to the Sunday Times with a base scenario. Now it's called the reasonable worst-case planning assumptions. Many are saying, look, this is really what is going to happen, even with all of the mitigating attempts to actually stop it from happening. This is still likely to happen. What's your take on it all?
All that stuff from the Remain tendency, who seem to have dominated everything in Parliament now, is complete and utter nonsense. Most of them haven't even read it. I have it sitting right in front of me now, and let me tell you, it is 5 pages long. That's it. And I could have done this. It's like writing something on the back of an envelope. In essence, things like they've got paragraph 3 here. They start with this sentence: France will impose EU mandatory controls on UK goods on day one, no deal. They go on to say the lack of trader readiness will lead to disruption. And they then go on also to say that they will be held up in the port in Calais when there won't be enough room, and that will block everything going back into Dover. Yet the port of Calais has made it clear, God knows how many times, that one, they will not stop any more trucks than they do at the moment, and they will let those where they might have some cushions about their paperwork go straight through. If they have to stop anybody, they're building an inspection point 40 kilometres away from the Calais port so that it doesn't stop the flow of trucks going through. And finally, they said it is not in our interest in any shape or form to have any delays in Calais, and we won't.
Well, hold on a minute. That's what the ports might say. But what about if the French president says, no, actually, we are going to make life difficult for you. We want every single item inspected. Then there will be delays, won't there?
No. They've made it very clear. The president of the Par du Nord, the head of the Calais ports have all said it doesn't matter what the politicians in Paris say, we are not reducing the flow through. And by the way, what's happening at Dover? Exactly the same. The government isn't going to stop trucks any more than they said, so they won't. So when I had a briefing on this before this thing ever came out under Privy Council terms, and I can tell you, when we confronted the people that were writing this report, and we said to them, when you did this report, at any stage did you discuss what is going to happen in Calais, just to make sure you're right? And they shuffled their feet, and they said no. And I said, why not? They said, because the government told us we were only to write this from our standpoint. We didn't have to discuss it.
So they didn't actually ask any of the experts?
This would be like you walking, getting up in the morning and asking yourself a very simple question. Oh, my God, I've got to cross a road. Well, that could lead to my demise. If I don't look right, what if I didn't look right? What if somebody else didn't stop at the zebra crossing? What if there was a barrier in the way and I crossed at the wrong point? All of this stuff. This is the kind of stuff they're dealing with. They're saying, oh, that won't be right, that won't be right, that won't be done, that will never be done. That means we won't get this. And so all of this stuff, 5 pages, that's all it is, of summary views from people saying, well, it could happen, so let's say it will happen.
And what's just funny, what about the people? I mean, there are an awful lot of people who discount a lot of this stuff as Project Fear anyway. The people who compiled this, not just civil servants, but we know a lot of the civil servants who were involved in all the Project Fear mongering ahead of the 2016 referendum, and an awful lot subsequently. We're told these are the experts, we're told they're civil servants, but of course we had only recently that battle between Jacob Rees-Mogg and Dr. David Nichol, who was talking about the problems for the medical supplies and for people who are sick and problems for the health service. And he's an eminent doctor, but he's also, we know, a very hard Remainer, someone who's campaigned very openly and very vociferously. Is it the case? You've worked very closely in government. You were, Work and Pension Secretary for many years. That actually, we are still, the Leave campaign is still up against an incredibly strong Remain contingent within the establishment, within the civil service, and this is just their next attack?
Well, I think the honest truth is, if we're really honest, 2 things about this. The first is, you're right in the sense that the establishment is massively dominated by the view that we should remain, and therefore, whether it's Parliament or whether it's in the wider organisation of government, if you were to scratch the personal opinions of most, they would say they don't believe in us leaving. Now, I'm not saying that means that they then deliberately write rubbish. All I'm saying is this paper was produced for one reason and one reason only. It was produced to say to government, essentially, all these areas you need to have mitigation for. That's what they were saying. So this is the reasonable worst case unless you mitigate. And the mitigations are all very obvious. And the government's done a huge amount anyway. This is the last government that did this under Theresa May, who weren't keen on leaving. So now this is a very different case. Yeah. So my point is that this whole thing comes down to one thing. Parliament's reaction to the court. It's all about a Remain-dominated Parliament versus a people whose sovereign. The people are sovereign in my book, not Parliament.
Well, I'd just love to see a report, the opposite of Operation Yellowhammer, looking at the best case scenario of what we're going to gain.